He thought humiliating her would earn him respect in front of his crew, but in less than 10 minutes, he was about to lose every ounce of it. The midday sun beat down on the construction site just outside Austin, Texas, where steel beams shimmered in the heat and the low hum of machinery filled the air like a constant warning that mistakes were not forgiven here. Derek Coleman stood at the center of it all, a hard hat tilted slightly back, arms crossed over his chest, his voice cutting through the noise as he barked orders to a dozen workers scrambling to meet a tight deadline. He was the kind of man who believed authority was something you displayed loudly, not something you earned quietly, and today, he had an audience. That was when Rachel Bennett stepped onto the gravel, her worn boots crunching softly beneath her feet, her plain denim shirt and faded jeans making her look more like someone running errands than someone who belonged on a multi-million-dollar project. She paused just long enough to take in the structure rising above her, her eyes scanning the beams, the joints, the alignment, not with curiosity, but with calculation. Derek noticed her almost immediately, his gaze sweeping over her in a quick, dismissive glance before a smirk formed at the corner of his mouth. "You lost, ma'am," he called out, loud enough for the nearest workers to hear, drawing a few chuckles that rippled across the site. Rachel didn't respond right away. She stepped closer, stopping just short of the marked safety line, her posture relaxed, her expression unreadable. "I'm here about the structural alignment on your east frame," she said calmly, her voice steady despite the attention now turning fully toward her. The laughter grew louder, sharper this time. One of the crew members shook his head, muttering something under his breath as Derek let out a short, amused breath. "Structural alignment," he repeated, dragging out the words as if tasting them for humor. "And what exactly would you know about that?" Rachel's eyes flicked briefly toward the steel column behind him, then back to Derek. "Enough to know it's off by at least half an inch at the base," she replied, her tone unchanged, almost conversational. For a split second, something shifted in the air, subtle but real, before Derek laughed again, louder this time, clapping his hands once as if she had just delivered the punchline he was waiting for. "Half an inch," he said, turning to his crew. "You hear that? We've got ourselves an expert." The crew joined in, a few whistles, a couple of sarcastic nods, the kind of reaction that turned a moment into a spectacle. Rachel stood there, unmoved, her gaze steady, not challenging, not defensive, just present. Derek stepped closer, his boots kicking up dust as he closed the distance, lowering his voice just enough to sound personal but loud enough to still carry. "Tell you what," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Since you've got it all figured out, why don't you show us?" He gestured toward the frame behind him, a casual motion that turned into an invitation wrapped in mockery. The crew quieted just a little, waiting, watching, the heat pressing in around them as if the entire site had leaned in to see what she would do next. Rachel didn't hesitate. She simply nodded once, as if the outcome had already been decided long before she stepped onto the gravel, and took her first step forward. Gravel shifted under Rachel Bennett's boots as she moved past the painted safety line, the low murmur of the crew trailing behind her like a wave that had not yet decided whether to crash or retreat, and for the first time since she arrived, the laughter began to thin, replaced by a quieter curiosity that hung in the hot Texas air. She did not rush. Each step was measured, deliberate, as if she had walked onto sites like this 1,000 times before, even though no one there recognized her. Derek Coleman folded his arms again, watching closely now, his earlier grin still in place but tighter, less certain, as Rachel stopped at the base of the east frame and crouched slightly, brushing a layer of dust from the steel plate with the edge of her glove. "Careful," one of the workers muttered under his breath, not quite mocking anymore, just unsure. Rachel did not respond. Her fingers traced along the anchor bolts, her eyes narrowing just slightly as she followed the line of the column upward, then back down again, calculating angles, weight distribution, tolerances that most people on the site only trusted their instruments to confirm. She reached for a nearby tape measure clipped to a worker's belt without asking, and he hesitated for a second before handing it over, almost automatically, as if something about her calm certainty made it difficult to refuse. The metallic snap echoed faintly as she extended the tape, anchoring it against the base plate and measuring along the edge with quiet precision. No one spoke. Even the machines in the background seemed distant now, like the entire site had pulled its attention into this one small moment. Rachel stood up slowly, glancing toward the column again before stepping a few feet to the side, adjusting her angle, repeating the measurement, confirming what she already knew. Derek shifted his weight, the dust crunching under his boots, and forced a short laugh that did not carry as far as before. "Well," he called out, louder than necessary, trying to reclaim the moment. "You find your half-inch yet?" A couple of workers chuckled, but it faded quickly, uncertain, as Rachel turned back toward him, holding the tape measure loosely in one hand. "It is actually closer to 5/8, she said evenly, her voice cutting through the air with a calm that did not need volume. The words landed differently this time. No laughter followed. Instead, a few heads turned toward the column, then back to her, as if reconsidering something they had dismissed too quickly. Derek's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before he shrugged, stepping forward, waving a hand dismissively. "Measurements do not mean much without context," he replied, his tone sharper now, defensive beneath the surface. "We are within tolerance." Rachel tilted her head slightly, not arguing, not pushing, just observing. "Your tolerance might be," she said, "but your load distribution will not be once you add the second level." A quiet ripple moved through the crew. One of the older workers, a man with decades etched into his posture, glanced up at the structure again, his brow tightening as if he had just noticed something he should have caught earlier. Derek noticed that shift, and it irritated him more than her words. "You are making assumptions," he said quickly, stepping closer, his voice firm, trying to reassert control. Rachel met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged. "No," she replied softly. "I am reading what is already there." The air between them stilled, heavy and expectant, as the crew stood caught between doubt and disbelief, and for the first time that afternoon, Derek Coleman realized that the attention he had drawn to her was no longer working in his favor. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, the kind that made people shift their weight and glance at each other without knowing why, and Rachel Bennett did not move to fill it. She simply turned back toward the structure as if the conversation had already ended in her mind. She walked a few steps along the base of the east frame, her eyes scanning upward again, following the line of steel beams to where they connected, her gaze lingering on a junction point that most of the crew had passed by all morning without a second thought. "If you do not adjust it now," she said calmly, almost as if she were thinking out loud, "you will be compensating for it on every level above this one." A low murmur rippled through the workers, quieter this time, thoughtful instead of mocking, as one of them set down his tool and took a step closer, squinting up at the same point she was studying. Derek Coleman felt the shift again, sharper now, like something slipping out of his grip, and he stepped forward quickly, his boots crunching against the gravel with more force than necessary. "We have engineers who signed off on these plans," he said, his voice firm, projecting confidence even as irritation crept beneath it. "Everything here has already been checked." Rachel nodded slightly, not dismissing him, but not yielding either. "The plans are fine," she replied, her tone steady. "The execution is where it changed." That landed harder than anything she had said before. A few heads turned toward Derek, not openly questioning him, but no longer fully aligned with him either, and that was enough to make his jaw tighten. "You are basing all of this on a tape measure and a guess," he said, sharper now, stepping closer until he was only a few feet away from her. "That is not how this works." Rachel finally looked directly at him again, her expression still calm, but there was something more behind her eyes now, not defiance, not arrogance, just certainty that did not need approval. "No," she said quietly. "It is based on experience." The word hung in the air, simple but heavy, and for a moment, no one spoke. Somewhere in the distance, a machine powered down with a low mechanical whine, leaving an even deeper silence in its wake. The older worker who had been watching earlier stepped forward now, his gaze moving between the base plate and the upper connection point again, his brow furrowed as he slowly nodded to himself. If that column is off, he said cautiously, not addressing anyone directly, it could throw the load when they frame the next level. Derek turned toward him sharply, the reaction immediate, almost reflexive. It is not off, he said, more forcefully than before, as if volume alone could settle the matter. But the certainty in his voice did not carry the same weight it had earlier. Rachel did not interrupt. She simply walked a few steps to a nearby equipment cart, picked up a small level, and returned to the base of the column without asking permission. The crew watched closely now, no laughter, no side comments, just attention. She placed the level carefully against the steel, adjusted it slightly, then stepped back just enough for others to see. The bubble shifted, subtle but undeniable, not centered, not aligned. No one spoke. The air felt different now, heavier, as realization began to settle in. Derek stared at it, his expression tightening as if he were trying to will it into place, but the small glass vial did not lie. Rachel lowered the level slowly, her movements unhurried, controlled. You still have time to correct it, she said, her voice calm, almost considerate. But not if you keep pretending it is not there. And in that moment, surrounded by his own crew, Derek Coleman felt the first crack form. Not in the structure behind him, but in the authority he had been so certain of just minutes earlier. For a moment, no one moved, not even the wind seemed to pass through the open steel frame, and the small off-centered bubble inside the level became the only thing that mattered on a job site that had been running on noise and confidence just minutes before. Derek Coleman exhaled slowly, forcing a short laugh that sounded thinner now, less convincing, as he reached out and took the level from Rachel's hand with a casual motion that did not quite hide the tension in his grip. Levels can be off, he said, turning it slightly as if searching for an angle that would prove her wrong. Tools get worn out. His voice carried, but it no longer commanded the same automatic agreement. A few of the crew exchanged glances, and the older worker stepped closer again, this time without hesitation. Try it on the other side, he suggested quietly, not challenging, just testing. Derek hesitated for half a second, then pressed the level against the opposite edge of the column. The bubble shifted again, just as clearly, just as precisely out of center. The silence deepened. Somewhere behind them, a metal beam creaked softly as it adjusted under the heat, a reminder that structures responded to forces whether people acknowledged them or not. Rachel did not say anything. She simply watched, her posture relaxed, her hands at her sides, as if she had already done her part. Derek pulled the level away and lowered it slowly, his jaw tightening as he looked up the length of the column again, this time not with dismissal, but with calculation. He walked a few steps back, squinting slightly, then moved to the side, trying to see what she had seen, retracing her perspective without admitting it. Even if it is off, he said after a moment, his voice more measured now, it is minor. We can compensate during framing. Rachel shook her head gently, not dismissive, just certain. You will not be compensating, she replied. You will be chasing it. A few of the crew let out quiet breaths, not quite reactions, more like realizations settling in. The older worker nodded again, slower this time. That kind of shift stacks, he said, almost to himself. By the time you've hit the second level, you are adjusting everything. Derek glanced at him sharply, then back at Rachel, the edges of his authority continuing to fray under the weight of facts he could not ignore. So what would you do, he asked finally, the question coming out more direct than he intended, stripped of its earlier sarcasm. Rachel stepped forward again, returning to the base of the column and crouched slightly, pointing toward the anchor bolts. Loosen these, she said, her voice steady, realign the base plate, then retighten and recheck before you set anything above it. She stood and looked up once more. It will take time now, but it will save you days later. The crew listened closely, some already glancing toward their tools, toward the bolts, toward each other, the shift in momentum almost physical. Derek remained still for a moment longer, caught between pride and practicality, the weight of every eye on the site pressing in on him. He looked at the column again, then at the level in his hand, then back at Rachel, and for the first time since she arrived, he did not have an immediate response. The noise of the site had not returned, the machine still distant, the air still heavy with expectation, as if the entire project was waiting on what he would say next, and in that quiet, it became clear that the decision he made now would define more than just the structure rising behind him. Derek Coleman drew in a slow breath, the kind that carried more weight than words, and for a brief moment, the entire site seemed to hold it with him, waiting to see whether he would double down or step back. His grip on the level tightened, then loosened, and he glanced once more at the column, the misalignment no longer something he could dismiss with confidence. The heat pressed down harder now, or maybe it just felt that way, the kind of pressure that came when every pair of eyes around you expected certainty and you were no longer sure you had it. He turned slightly, looking at his crew, men who had trusted his calls without question for months, men who were now watching him with a different kind of attention, quieter, more measured. Rachel Bennett did not move. She stood a few feet away, not pushing, not pressing, her presence steady, almost neutral, as if the outcome mattered less to her than the fact that the truth had been seen. "We are not tearing this apart based on one measurement," Derek said finally, his voice controlled, but lacking the sharp edge it once had. It was not a command this time, more of a defense, something to hold on to. The older worker stepped forward again, slower now, respectful but firm. "It is not just one measurement," he said, gesturing toward the column. "We all saw it." A few others nodded, subtle at first, then more clearly, the shift spreading through the group like a quiet agreement that did not need to be spoken out loud. Derek's jaw tightened again, but this time it was not anger that held it there, it was calculation, the kind that came when the cost of being wrong started to outweigh the cost of admitting it. He looked back at Rachel, studying her more carefully now, as if seeing her for the first time without the filter of assumption. "You said 5 minutes," he said, his tone lower, more deliberate. Rachel gave a small nod. "To confirm," she replied. "The correction will take longer." Another silence followed, shorter this time, more focused. Derek turned back to the column, then down at the base plate, then to the tools resting nearby, each glance pulling him closer to a decision he could no longer avoid. Finally, he exhaled and lifted his hand slightly, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to signal. "Loosen the bolts," he said. The words landed with a quiet finality that carried more authority than any shout he had given earlier. The crew moved almost immediately, but not with the rushed energy of before. This time their motions were precise, attentive, as if they understood the importance of getting it right. Wrenches were picked up, metal clinked softly, and the first bolt turned with a low, controlled sound that seemed to echo more than it should have. Rachel stepped forward again, not taking over, but guiding with small, deliberate gestures, pointing out where to adjust, where to hold, where to check. Again before tightening. She did not raise her voice, did not demand attention, yet every instruction was followed without hesitation. Derek stood just to the side now, watching, not leading, not interrupting, his earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, something closer to respect, though he had not said it yet. As the column shifted slightly into alignment, subtle but undeniable, one of the workers placed the level back against the steel. The bubble settled into the center, steady, exact. No one spoke. The moment did not need commentary. Derek looked at it, then at Rachel, and for the first time that afternoon, there was no trace of mockery in his expression, only the realization that the person he had tried to turn into a joke had just saved his entire project from a mistake he had refused to see, and in that quiet, under the relentless Texas sun, the hierarchy he had relied on all day shifted without a single word needing to announce it. The centered bubble held steady, almost impossibly still, and for a few seconds no one moved as if any motion might disturb the quiet truth it represented, and Rachel Bennett simply stepped back, giving the space back to the crew without claiming anything that had just happened. The low hum of the site slowly returned, distant at first, then building, but it sounded different now, less chaotic, more deliberate, like a rhythm that had been corrected. One of the workers let out a soft breath and nodded, not toward Derek, but toward Rachel, a small gesture that carried more weight than any words. Another picked up his tools with renewed focus, double-checking his own measurements before continuing. as if the standard on the site had quietly shifted in the last few minutes. Derek Coleman remained where he stood, the level still in his hand, his gaze fixed on the column for a moment longer before it drifted back to Rachel. He looked like a man recalculating more than just a structure, his posture no longer rigid with authority, but grounded, almost thoughtful. "You caught it early," he said finally, his voice lower, stripped of its earlier edge, the words not quite an apology, but not far from it. Rachel gave a small nod, not seeking acknowledgement, not dismissing it either. "That is the job," she replied simply. The older worker stepped in again, this time with a faint hint of respect in his expression. "Not many would have seen that walking in," he said, glancing between them. Rachel did not respond to the compliment. Instead, she looked back at the structure, her eyes scanning once more, as if ensuring there was nothing else waiting to be uncovered. Derek followed her gaze, then looked back at her, something unspoken settling in his expression. "You said it would have cost us days," he added, more to himself than to her. "At least," Rachel answered, her tone calm. "And likely more once everything above it had to be corrected." A quiet understanding moved through the crew, a shared recognition of what had almost happened, of the time, the cost, the reputation that could have been affected, and how close they had come without realizing it. Derek exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost beneath the returning noise of the site, and for the first time that day, he seemed less concerned with how he appeared and more focused on what was actually right. "We will recheck the rest of the frame," he said, not loudly, but with a clarity that carried across the team. "Everything." There was no resistance this time, no hesitation, just nods and movement, the crew spreading out with a new level of attention, each person more aware, more precise, as if they had all been reminded of something important at the same moment. Rachel stepped back further now, her role already complete, her presence no longer at the center of the scene, yet still shaping it in a way no one could ignore. Derek watched her for a moment, then took a step closer, not in confrontation, but in recognition. "You are not just passing through, are you?" he said, the question quiet, almost careful. Rachel met his gaze briefly, her expression steady, then gave a faint, knowing look that did not fully answer him. "I was in the area," she said. It was not the whole truth, but it was enough. Derek nodded slowly, accepting it for what it was, his earlier assumptions now replaced with something far more grounded. Around them, the site moved with renewed purpose, tools clinking, measurements being called out, adjustments made with care, and above it all, the structure stood a little straighter, a little more certain, as if it too had felt the shift. And in that moment, without any formal announcement, the lesson settled into everyone present, not spoken, but understood, that the loudest voice in the room had not been the one who knew the most, and that respect, once lost in a single careless laugh, had just been rebuilt in silence. The rhythm of the site had changed, not just in movement but in mindset, and as the crew spread out across the structure double-checking alignments and measurements, a quiet precision replaced the earlier noise of assumption, each step now deliberate, each adjustment made with care that had not been there before. Rachel Bennett stood near the edge of the work zone, no longer at the center of attention, yet impossible to ignore, her presence lingering in the way the crew now paused before tightening bolts, in the way they rechecked angles instead of trusting first impressions. Derek Coleman watched it all unfold, his gaze moving from one worker to another, then back to the structure itself, as if seeing the entire project through a different lens for the first time. He took a slow step toward the east frame again, running his hand lightly along the steel column, not to assert control, but to feel the alignment, to confirm what had been corrected, and when he looked up, his expression carried something quieter, something closer to respect than authority. "Check the west side as well," he called out, his voice steady but no longer sharp, and this time, the instruction was followed not out of habit, but out of agreement. A few workers moved immediately, tools in hand, measuring, adjusting, their earlier skepticism now replaced with a shared focus that connected them in a way that had not existed before Rachel stepped onto the gravel. The older worker approached Rachel slowly, wiping his hands on a cloth as he stopped a few feet away. "You ever run jobs like this?" he asked, not out of curiosity alone, but out of recognition. Rachel glanced toward the structure. Then back at him, her expression calm. Sometimes, she said, her answer simple, leaving more unsaid than explained. He nodded, as if that was enough, as if the way she had handled the situation spoke louder than any title she could have given. Across the site, Derek noticed the exchange, and for a brief moment, something crossed his face, not irritation, not defensiveness, but realization, the kind that settled slowly and stayed. He walked over, stopping a few steps from Rachel, not invading her space, but no longer keeping his distance either. You saw it faster than anyone here, he said, his tone measured, not questioning, not challenging, just stating a fact he could not ignore. Rachel looked at him briefly, then back at the structure. I was looking for it, she replied. The answer lingered, quiet but significant, and Derek understood more from that single sentence than from everything that had been said earlier. He nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried more weight than any apology he could have offered, and turned back toward the crew. We adjust the rest before we move forward, he said, not loudly, but with clarity, and this time, there was no need to repeat himself. The crew moved with purpose, each person more aware, more connected to the work than before, as if the standard had been reset without anyone needing to announce it. Rachel took a step back, then another, her role complete, her presence no longer required to guide the process she had already corrected. No one stopped her, but several glanced in her direction, subtle nods, quiet recognition, the kind that did not need words to be understood. Derek watched her as she turned slightly toward the edge of the site, her figure blending once again into the simplicity she had arrived with, and for a moment, he considered saying more, asking more, but something held him back, not hesitation, but respect for the fact that she did not need to explain herself to be understood. The structure behind him stood straighter now, not just in steel, but in the mindset of the people building it, and as the afternoon sun cast longer shadows across the site, the lesson settled deeper into the rhythm of their work, that skill did not announce itself, and that the quietest person in the room could carry the kind of knowledge that changed everything without ever raising their voice. By late afternoon, the sun had shifted just enough to cast long shadows across the steel frame, stretching every beam and column into sharp lines that made even the smallest misalignment impossible to hide, and yet now, everything stood clean, precise, corrected before it could become a problem. The crew moved with a rhythm that felt almost synchronized, each person working with a level of awareness that had not been there that morning, as if one quiet moment had recalibrated the entire site. Rachel Bennett had nearly reached the edge of the gravel when a voice called out behind her, not loud, not commanding, but clear enough to carry. Rachel. She paused, turning slightly, not surprised, as Derek Coleman walked toward her, his pace steady, his posture no longer carrying the same rigid edge it once had. Up close, there was a different weight to his expression now, less about control, more about understanding. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the sounds of the site continuing around them, but no longer dominating the space between them. Derek glanced back toward the structure, then returned his gaze to her. You knew what you were looking at before you even stepped in, he said, not as a question, but as a realization that had taken time to fully settle. Rachel met his eyes briefly, her expression unchanged. I have seen it before, she replied. The simplicity of her answer left no room for exaggeration, no need for explanation, and somehow that made it carry even more weight. Derek nodded slowly, absorbing that, then let out a quiet breath. We would have missed it, he admitted, the words measured, deliberate, each one chosen with care. There was no audience this time, no need to perform, just a statement that stood on its own. Rachel did not respond right away. She glanced back toward the structure once more, her eyes scanning it in that same quiet, calculated way, then returned her attention to him. You would have found it eventually, she said. But not before it cost you. Derek gave a faint, almost reluctant smile at that, the kind that came from recognizing truth rather than resisting it. Behind them, one of the workers called out a measurement, another confirmed it, and the sound carried with a clarity that reflected the new standard they were all working under. Derek shifted his weight slightly, then reached up and adjusted his hard hat, a small, almost unconscious motion. "You do not just pass through job sites for no reason," he said, his tone more certain now, though still calm. Rachel held his gaze for a moment longer this time, then gave a slight tilt of her head. "Sometimes I check on things," she said. The answer was quiet, but it landed with more meaning than it revealed, and Derek understood that pushing further would not give him anything more than what she had already shown. He nodded once, a gesture that carried respect without needing to name it. "Well," he said after a moment, glancing back at the structure again, "you saved us more than time today." Rachel did not smile, but there was a subtle shift in her expression, something softer, almost reflective. "Just doing the work," she replied. The words were simple, but in the quiet space between them, they carried the weight of everything that had happened. Derek looked at her for a second longer, then stepped back slightly, not dismissing her, but giving her space, acknowledging something unspoken. Around them, the sight continued, steady, focused, the earlier chaos replaced with intention, and as Rachel turned once more toward the edge of the gravel, her figure blending again into the ordinary, it became clear that nothing about what had just happened would be forgotten, not by the structure, not by the crew, and certainly not by the man who had learned, in front of everyone, that respect could be lost in a moment of laughter and rebuilt only through the quiet truth of skill. The sun dipped lower toward the horizon, casting a warm amber glow across the steel structure that now stood aligned with quiet precision, every beam and joint reflecting a level of care that had not been there when the day began, and as the crew continued their work, there was a subtle shift in how they carried themselves, less rushed, more aware, as if each movement now held purpose beyond just finishing the job. Rachel Bennett reached the edge of the gravel path and paused briefly, not to look back, but as if acknowledging the weight of what had been left behind, the kind of impact that did not need recognition to exist. Behind her, Derek Coleman stood near the east frame, watching the final adjustments being made, his eyes tracing the clean lines of the structure, but his thoughts clearly elsewhere, replaying moments from earlier that now felt distant, almost unreal in contrast to what had followed. One of the workers approached him, holding a set of updated measurements, and Derek took them, scanning quickly before nodding. "Everything lines up," the worker said, his tone carrying a quiet confidence. Derek nodded again, slower this time. "Keep it that way," he replied, but there was no sharpness in his voice, only clarity. The worker moved off, and Derek's gaze drifted back toward the edge of the site where Rachel had stood just moments before, but she was already gone, her presence leaving no trace except in the way everything now functioned better because of it. The older worker stepped beside him, following his line of sight for a moment before speaking. "You do not forget something like that," he said quietly. Derek shook his head slightly, not denying it. "No," he answered, his voice low. "You do not." For a few seconds, neither of them spoke, the sounds of the site filling the space, steady and consistent, no longer chaotic. Derek adjusted his gloves slowly, then looked back at the structure one more time, the corrected column standing as a quiet reminder of how close things had come to going wrong, and how easily it could have been ignored. "Funny thing," he said after a moment, more to himself than anyone else, "it was right there the whole time." The older worker gave a faint nod. "It usually is," he replied. Derek let out a slow breath, the realization settling deeper now, not just about the structure, but about the way he had handled everything leading up to it, the assumptions, the dismissal, the laughter that now felt misplaced in a way he could not ignore. He looked down briefly, then back up, his posture different now, not smaller, but grounded, as if something unnecessary had been stripped away. Around him, the crew continued working, but there was a new kind of respect woven into their movements, not just for the work itself, but for the idea that skill did not need to announce itself to be real. As the last of the adjustments were secured and the level confirmed alignment across the frame, a quiet satisfaction settled over the site, not loud, not celebrated, just understood. Derek turned slightly, taking in the full structure, then gave a small nod to himself, a silent acknowledgement of what had been learned without needing to say it out loud. And as the evening light softened the edges of steel and shadow, one truth remained, steady and undeniable, that the person who had spoken the least had changed the most, and that respect, once given freely to titles and voices, had found its rightful place in something far quieter, something earned, something real.